Falling in love with someone I wasn't allowed to want nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself. Before I tell you what happened, I need to ask you a small favor. If stories like mine keep you up at night wondering what you'd do in my place, go ahead and subscribe to RP, Forbidden Romances, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. It genuinely helps bring more stories like this one to life, and I promise, this one is worth staying for. My name is Claire, and back then, I was 28 years old, living a life that looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale. I was the heir to one of the most exclusive fashion houses in the country, a legacy my grandfather built from nothing. My face had been on more magazine covers than I could count. I'd even worn a crown once, years earlier, in a pageant my mother insisted would open doors for the family name. People assumed I had everything. What they never saw was how heavy a crown can get when you never asked to wear it in the first place. Every morning started the same way. Someone did my hair. Someone else chose my outfit before I even opened my eyes. My mother would already be on the phone, deciding which events I needed to be seen at that week, and with whom. I learned to smile before I learned to speak my own mind, and somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the difference between the two. At night, alone in my closet, I used to try on clothes nobody had picked for me, just to remember what choosing something for myself actually felt like. I was engaged to a man named Grant. He was kind, genuinely kind, in a way that made it almost impossible to complain about anything. He remembered small details, like my favorite coffee order or my nanny's birthday. He'd look at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Our families had arranged things between us long before either of us had much say, tying two company names together like a business merger dressed up in white lace. And the strange, aching truth was this: being adored by someone so good only made the emptiness inside me louder. I used to sit at dinner across from him, nodding along, laughing at the right moments, and feel a cold, hollow space open up right behind my ribs. It wasn't his fault. He never did anything wrong. That was almost the worst part, if I'm being honest with you. How do you explain to anyone that you're suffocating inside a life that everyone else would kill to have? How do you admit that you feel like a beautiful bird locked in a cage made of gold, when the whole world keeps telling you how lucky you are to live there? There was a notebook I kept hidden in the back of my drawer, filled with lines I never showed anyone, little poems, half-finished thoughts, things I was too afraid to say out loud. The last thing I'd written, only weeks before everything changed, was one simple line: I want to be loved by someone who doesn't profit from it. I remember staring at those words in the dim light of my bedroom, wondering if a love like that even existed anywhere in my world. My family had a wedding to attend that season, the kind of high society event where everyone who mattered in Manhattan would be under one roof. I didn't think much of it going in. Just another night of forced smiles and careful conversation. Another evening of being watched more than being seen. I picked out a dress that made my mother nod in approval, put on the mask I wore so well by then, and told myself it would be over by midnight. I had no idea that night would end with my whole life split open, quite literally, in front of hundreds of strangers. I had no idea that a stranger's hands would end up holding half of something meant only for me. And I certainly had no idea that the woman standing across that ballroom, the one everyone in the fashion world both feared and admired, was about to become the reason I finally understood what it meant to want something so badly it terrified me. I still remember the exact moment the lights shifted, the murmur that swept through the crowd like a held breath finally released. Something was about to happen that no one in that room, least of all me, would ever be able to explain away as coincidence. The room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms only go quiet right before something unforgettable happens. I remember the string quartet finishing its last note, the way the bride's laughter carried over the crowd, bright and easy, completely unaware of what her own bouquet was about to set in motion. I was standing near the back, half hidden behind a pillar wrapped in white orchids, sipping champagne I didn't actually want just to have something to do with my hands. My mother had already pointed out 3 men in the room she thought I should be photographed next to. I wasn't listening to a word of it. The bride turned, counted down with her fingers, and threw. I watched the bouquet spin through the air in that strange, slow way things do when your whole attention narrows down to one single point. A gust caught it near the top of its arc, right as someone pushed through the double doors behind us, and the thin ribbon holding the two halves together simply gave out. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. It looked almost impossible, like watching something break apart in a dream. And then, before I could think, before I could step back or step forward, one half of that bouquet landed directly in my hands. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave. I looked down at the flowers in my palms, stunned, my heart suddenly pounding for no reason I could name. Then I looked up, and that's when I saw her. She was standing maybe 10 feet away, holding the other half, looking just as caught off guard as I felt. I knew exactly who she was, of course. Everyone in our world knew Evelyn Hartwell. Ruthless, brilliant, the kind of woman whose name alone could make a boardroom go silent. We'd been rivals for years, in the quiet, polished way people in our industry are rivals, all careful smiles and sharper words underneath. I'd never once looked at her and felt my breath catch in my throat, until that exact second. Something about the way the light hit her red hair, the way her jaw was set even in surprise, made it impossible to look away. Her eyes found mine across that ridiculous distance of polished floor, and for one endless moment, neither of us moved. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something stranger than that. It felt like being recognized by someone for the very first time, even though we'd stood in the same rooms for years. The photographers loved it, of course. Flashes went off from every direction, capturing two of Manhattan's most notorious businesswomen holding torn halves of a wedding bouquet like some kind of omen. I heard someone nearby joke about fate, about how the flowers must have known something we didn't. I laughed along, the way I'd been trained to laugh at things that made me uncomfortable. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and it had nothing to do with the champagne. Grant found me a few minutes later, slipping an arm around my waist, smiling at the story already spreading through the room. He thought it was charming, a funny little moment to bring up at dinner parties for years to come. I smiled back at him and let him lead me toward our table. But my eyes kept drifting across the room, searching for a flash of red hair I told myself I wasn't looking for. I caught her watching me twice more that night. Both times she looked away first, which somehow made it worse. There was something almost violent about the way my chest tightened each time our eyes met, like my body understood something my mind refused to admit yet. I told myself it was nothing. Rivals notice each other. That's simply what rivals do. By the time the car pulled up to take us home, I still had the broken half of that bouquet pressed against my chest, petals crushed slightly from how tightly I'd been holding it without realizing. Grant asked if I wanted to throw it away. I told him I'd hold on to it a little longer. I didn't tell him the real reason, mostly because I didn't understand it myself yet. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, replaying the exact second our eyes had met from across that ballroom. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself a lot of things that year that turned out not to be true. I had no way of knowing, as I finally drifted off to sleep with those bruised white petals still on my nightstand, that fate wasn't finished with the two of us. Not even close. Weeks passed before I saw her again, though I found myself thinking about her far more than I wanted to admit. It was strange, the way she'd gone from being a name I dreaded seeing on a guest list to someone whose absence felt like a held breath I couldn't release. We texted occasionally, careful, professional messages that gave away nothing to anyone who might have read them over our shoulders. But underneath the polite words, something else was always humming quietly. The next time fate brought us together, it wasn't an accident at all. She texted me one afternoon, asking if I wanted to preview some fabric samples for a potential collaboration between our houses, the kind of professional excuse two people invent when they both know it isn't really about fabric. I said yes before I'd even finished reading the message. I told myself it was purely business. I changed my outfit 3 times before leaving my apartment that evening. which should have told me everything I refused to admit to myself. We met at her office after hours, the building nearly empty, most of the staff long gone for the night. The samples were spread across a long table under warm lighting, silk and wool and cashmere in colors I barely registered because I was far more aware of the 2 feet of space between us as we stood side by side, pretending to examine them. Her perfume reached me before anything else did, something warm and slightly spiced, and I found myself leaning in closer than the fabric actually required, just to stay inside that scent a little longer. "This one," she said, holding up a deep burgundy silk, her fingers brushing mine as she passed it over. I felt that small contact everywhere, a jolt traveling up my arm and settling somewhere behind my ribs. Neither of us pulled away right away. I looked up at her, and she was already looking at me, closer than I'd realized, close enough that I could see the fine gold flecks in her eyes I'd never noticed under harsher lighting. "Evelyn," I started, though I had no idea what I meant to say after her name. She didn't answer with words. Her gaze dropped briefly to my mouth, then back up, and I watched her breath catch, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. My own heart was hammering so hard I was certain she could hear it in the silent room. Neither of us moved for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. She reached up slowly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, her fingers trailing along my jaw afterward like she couldn't quite bring herself to pull away yet. Her hand was warm against my skin, and it was trembling, just slightly, in a way that felt more honest than anything she'd ever said to me in words. I leaned into that touch without meaning to, my eyes fluttering closed for one unguarded second. The space between us had shrunk to almost nothing. "I keep telling myself to stop," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it over the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I don't know how anymore. I opened my eyes and found her staring at my lips again, her own parted slightly, her breathing uneven in a way that mirrored exactly what was happening inside my chest. We were close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating off her skin, close enough that closing the last few inches between us would have taken nothing at all. My phone buzzed sharply on the table beside the fabric samples, shattering the silence like glass. We both flinched apart instantly, putting a full step of distance between us before either of us had consciously decided to move. I glanced down and saw Grant's name lighting up the screen, a simple message asking what time I'd be home for dinner. The ordinary, gentle question felt like ice water thrown over everything that had just been building between us. Evelyn stepped back further, running a hand through her hair, her composed mask sliding back into place so quickly it almost looked painful. "You should probably answer that," she said, her voice carefully even again, though I could see her hands weren't quite steady as she began folding the fabric samples away. I nodded, throat tight, unable to find any words that felt safe enough to say out loud. I left her office a few minutes later, with a swatch of burgundy silk I didn't actually need. My whole body still humming from how close we'd come to something neither of us could take back. Sitting in the car on the way home, I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, my heart refusing to slow down no matter how many deep breaths I took. I had almost kissed Evelyn Hartwell in an empty office, and the only thing that stopped me was a text message from the man I was supposed to marry. I told myself, as I always did, that this had to stop somewhere, that we'd been given a warning, a small mercy, a chance to step back before things went too far to undo. But some quiet, honest part of me already knew that warnings like that rarely worked on hearts that had already made up their minds. I had no idea, climbing those steps to my own front door that night, that the next time fate put us alone in a room together, there would be no phone call loud enough to stop what was coming. A charity event pulled us back into the same orbit again, barely a week later, though by then I think we'd both stopped pretending these collisions were accidental. It was raining again that night, because apparently the universe had decided rain would be the backdrop for every turning point in this story. The gala ended early when a pipe burst somewhere in the building, sending everyone scrambling for the exits in evening gowns and borrowed umbrellas, laughing and shrieking as the storm caught half the guests before they reached their cars. I found myself pressed under a narrow awning outside, having lost Grant somewhere in the chaos of the crowd, when Evelyn appeared beside me, equally soaked, equally out of breath from running. We stood there together, sheltered from the worst of the downpour, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. The street beyond us had gone strange and quiet, most of the crowd having scattered toward waiting cars, leaving just the sound of rain hammering against the awning above our heads. "We keep doing this," she said, a small, breathless laugh escaping her, rainwater still dripping from the ends of her hair. I laughed too, though my heart was pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the sudden downpour. "Doing what?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew exactly what she meant. She turned to look at me then, and whatever teasing had been in her voice a moment earlier disappeared completely. "Finding reasons to end up alone together," she said quietly, her eyes searching mine like she was looking for permission to say more. The rain kept falling around us, a curtain separating our small patch of shelter from the rest of the world. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips, everywhere at once. "I'm not sorry about it," I heard myself admit, my voice barely above a whisper. Something in her expression broke open at that, all the careful control she wore like armor finally slipping away completely. She stepped closer, close enough now that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek. Close enough that the last of my careful excuses simply evaporated into the wet night air. "Claire?" she said, my name sounding different in her mouth than it ever had before. Softer, almost like a question she was afraid to finish asking. I reached up first, my trembling fingers finding the lapel of her rain-soaked coat, and that small motion seemed to be all the answer she needed. She cupped my face gently, like I was something she was afraid might disappear if she moved too fast, and closed the distance between us. The kiss, when it finally happened, tasted faintly of rain and months of longing we'd both been too afraid to name out loud. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't reckless. It felt like relief, like finally setting down something impossibly heavy after carrying it alone for far too long. Her hands slid into my damp hair, and mine curled tighter into the fabric of her coat, holding on like she might vanish the second I let go. I forgot about the rain, about Grant somewhere searching for me in the crowd, about every single reason this was supposed to be impossible. There was only the warmth of her, the soft, unhurried way she kissed me like she'd been waiting years for exactly this moment. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads stayed pressed together, both of us breathing unevenly, neither of us quite ready to step back into the space between two separate people again. "I have wanted to do that," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "since the night of that ridiculous bouquet." I let out a small, watery laugh, tears mixing with rain on my cheeks that I hadn't even realized were falling. I think some part of me knew that night too, I admitted. I just didn't have the courage to say it. She brushed a thumb gently across my cheekbone, wiping away a tear I hadn't managed to hide fast enough, her eyes full of something so tender it nearly undid me completely. We stood there under that narrow awning far longer than we should have, the city moving on around us, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. Eventually, headlights swept across the wet pavement, my driver finally spotting me through the storm, and reality came rushing back in with all its complicated, unavoidable weight. Evelyn stepped back first, her hand lingering in mine until the very last possible second, like neither of us wanted to be the one to let go. I climbed into that car with my lips still warm and my whole body humming with something I hadn't let myself feel in years. I pressed my fingers briefly against my mouth, replaying every second of it, terrified and thrilled in equal measure by what we'd just done. I had no way of knowing, watching her figure disappear into the rain through the back window, that a single photograph taken from across that street would be enough to unravel everything we'd both been trying so carefully to protect. The photograph appeared online less than 48 hours later, grainy and taken from across the street, but clear enough to leave nothing to the imagination. Two women, tangled together under a narrow awning in the rain, my hand fisted in the lapel of her coat, her palm cradling my face like something precious. Someone had captured the exact moment I thought belonged only to us. And by the time I woke up that morning, it was already spreading across every gossip account that covered our industry. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, scrolling through headline after headline with a kind of numb horror, watching strangers speculate about my life in real time. Some of the comments were cruel. Some were oddly gleeful, treating the whole thing like entertainment rather than two people's private hearts laid bare for public consumption. My mother called 17 times before I finally answered, her voice sharp with a panic I'd never heard from her before, not even close. "Fix this," she said, before I'd even managed a proper hello. "Whatever this is, whatever nonsense photograph is circulating, you fix it, and you fix it today." I tried to explain, though my voice came out smaller and more uncertain than I wanted it to. She didn't let me finish a single sentence. By that afternoon, my family had already scheduled an emergency meeting with Grant's parents, the kind of meeting where decisions get made about your life while you're sitting quietly in the room, barely allowed to speak. They moved the wedding date up by nearly a year, just like that. Over tea and forced smiles, as though rearranging my entire future were as simple as rebooking a restaurant reservation. My mother framed it as protecting the family name, as putting an end to ugly rumors before they could do any real damage to the business. Grant sat beside me through the whole meeting, quiet and pale, occasionally reaching for my hand, like he was trying to reassure both of us of something neither of us fully believed anymore. I tried reaching Evelyn that same evening, desperate for some kind of comfort in the middle of the storm closing in around me. My first few messages went unanswered. When she finally did respond, hours later, her tone had changed completely, clipped and distant in a way that felt like a door quietly closing between us. "We should be more careful," she wrote. "This can't happen again right now." I read those words over and over, searching for some warmth underneath them that simply wasn't there anymore. I later learned, though not from her directly, that her own board had called an emergency session the same morning the photograph broke. Men in expensive suits, none of whom had ever asked how she was actually doing since her divorce, suddenly deeply concerned about optics and shareholder confidence. I imagined her sitting in that boardroom, absorbing lecture after lecture about image and reputation, learning once again that even her heart was something other people felt entitled to manage on her behalf. I understood, in some distant, rational part of my mind, why she'd pulled back the way she had. That didn't make the silence hurt any less. I kept checking my phone obsessively, refreshing a conversation that had gone cold overnight, replaying every second under that awning, and wondering if I'd imagined how real it had felt. Grant, meanwhile, kept trying so hard to make me smile again, planning small gestures, bringing home flowers, completely unaware that every kindness now felt like another stone added to a foundation I could feel cracking beneath us. 3 days passed with barely a word from Evelyn. I threw myself into wedding planning out of sheer desperation, picking out flowers and fabric samples with a hollow kind of efficiency, going through the motions of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. At night, I'd pull out my phone and stare at our last real conversation, the one from the fabric samples, back when things still felt warm and possible between us. I didn't dare send anything else. I was too afraid of what more silence might do to what was left of my heart. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, I finally broke down and called her, fully expecting it to ring out unanswered like the last 2 attempts had. Instead, after only 2 rings, she picked up. I heard her breath catch on the other end before either of us said a single word, and something in that small, unguarded sound told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't been avoiding me because she'd stopped feeling anything. She'd been drowning in the exact same fear I had, just from the opposite side of a silence neither of us knew how to break first. "I found something in my coat pocket last night," she said quietly, her voice rough, like she hadn't used it in days. "A little of your perfume, still there, weeks later." I sat on my bathroom floor for an hour just breathing it in like an idiot. I closed my eyes, tears sliding down my cheeks in the dark of my bedroom. Relief and heartbreak tangled together so tightly I could barely separate one from the other. Neither of us said much else that night. We simply stayed on the line together, listening to each other breathe, both of us finally admitting, without quite saying the words, that pretending this was over had never actually been an option for either one of us. I was still holding the phone against my ear, still listening to the quiet sound of her breathing on the other end, when I heard it. A soft knock at my bedroom door, followed by the particular creak of the handle turning before I'd even had the chance to answer. I sat up fast, my heart slamming against my ribs, the phone nearly slipping from my hand. Through the narrow gap of the door, I could just make out a figure standing there in the dark hallway, silhouetted by the hall light behind them. And for one terrifying second, I couldn't tell if they'd heard anything at all. It was Grant. He stood there in the dim hallway light, still dressed from dinner, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable in a way I'd never seen on him before. I don't know how long he'd been standing there, or how much he'd actually heard, but the look on his face told me it was enough. I ended the call without saying goodbye, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone entirely. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have been. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it so much worse than if he'd shouted. I opened my mouth to explain, to soften it, to find some version of the truth that wouldn't break him completely. Nothing came out. He nodded slowly, like my silence had already answered the question better than words ever could, and sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at his own hands. "I think some part of me already knew," he said after a while. "I used to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe I just wasn't paying close enough attention." I sat down beside him, close but not touching, guilt pressing down on my chest so heavily I could barely breathe. I told him I was sorry, that he deserved so much better than finding out this way, that none of it had ever been about anything he'd done wrong. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he simply nodded again. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt," he said, turning to look at me for the first time since he'd sat down. "But I'd rather know the truth and lose you than spend the rest of my life married to someone who was only ever half here." There was no anger in his voice, only a tired, aching honesty that somehow made me respect him more in that moment than I ever had before. He reached over, squeezed my hand once, gently, and let go for what felt like the very last time. He left my apartment a little after midnight, taking nothing with him but his coat and the quiet dignity he'd carried through the entire conversation. I sat alone on the edge of my bed for a long time afterward, crying in a way that felt like grief and relief tangled into something I couldn't quite separate. I had broken a good man's heart. I had also, for the first time in longer than I could remember, stopped lying to myself about what I actually wanted. I didn't call Evelyn that night. I needed to sit with what had just happened, to let it settle somewhere real before I brought her into it. But even through the tears, even through the guilt sitting heavy in my chest, there was a small, steady warmth underneath it all, quiet, but unmistakable, telling me that for the first time in years, my life finally belonged to me. What I didn't know yet was that while I was ending things with Grant, Evelyn was facing her own reckoning across town, one that involved a woman named Vivian, a boardroom full of nervous investors, and a decision that would determine whether she had anything left to offer me at all. I found out what happened that night only later, pieced together from what Evelyn told me herself over the weeks that followed, though by the time she finally shared it with me, I felt like I'd lived through every second of it right alongside her. While I was sitting alone in the wreckage of my broken engagement, she was walking into her own office building, straight into an emergency board meeting called specifically to discuss what they were calling, with cold corporate precision, her personal brand liability. 6 men sat around that long glass table, none of whom had ever once asked how she was actually holding up since her divorce. all of them suddenly very concerned about shareholder confidence and public image. They passed around printouts of that leaked photograph like it was a quarterly earnings report, discussing her private heart in the same flat tone they'd used to discuss a failed product line. She told me later that she sat there in silence for the first 10 minutes, letting them talk, feeling something cold and familiar settle over her, the same armor she'd worn her entire career. Then, something in her simply refused to put that armor back on one more time. "I've spent 20 years building this company," she told them, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "And I will not spend whatever years I have left apologizing for who I love." The room went completely silent. One board member started to argue about optics, about investor confidence, and she cut him off without raising her voice even slightly. "If my happiness is a liability to this company, then perhaps the company needs to reconsider its values, not the other way around." She told me she watched their faces shift from irritation to something closer to shock, unaccustomed to hearing her speak with anything other than calculated composure. Later that same afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor at her office. Vivian, the woman who'd made no secret of her interest in Evelyn over the past several months, appeared at her door with 2 coffees, and an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read at first. They sat together for nearly an hour, and Evelyn told me she'd braced herself for anger, for some kind of confrontation about the photograph that had already reached every corner of their industry. Instead, Vivian simply smiled, a little sadly, and set one of the coffees down on Evelyn's desk. "I always knew," she said, "that whenever you finally looked at someone the way I wanted you to look at me, it wasn't going to be me standing there." Evelyn tried to apologize, tried to find some way to soften the truth, but Vivian just shook her head gently. "Don't. I'd rather have watched you find real happiness with someone else than spent years wondering what might have happened if you'd settled for something smaller with me." She stood, straightened her jacket, and left with a quiet grace that Evelyn said she'd never forget, closing a door neither of them needed to slam. By the time evening came, Evelyn told me she sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring out at the city lights, finally feeling the full weight of everything she'd said in that boardroom. She'd spent her entire adult life building walls, so carefully constructed that even she sometimes forgot what she was protecting behind them. And for the first time, she said, tearing one of those walls down hadn't felt like losing control. It had felt like finally breathing. She called me a little after 10 that night, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, carrying none of its usual armor. She told me everything: the board, Vivian, the quiet, terrifying relief of finally saying out loud what she actually wanted instead of what looked safest on paper. I sat on my bedroom floor listening to her, my own heart still raw from saying goodbye to Grant only hours earlier, and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in days. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said quietly, "but I also don't want to do that here, in this city, with everyone watching to see if we survive it." I understood exactly what she meant. Our whole world had turned our love into a spectacle before we'd even had the chance to understand it ourselves. "Then let's not give them the chance to watch," I told her, surprising myself with how certain I felt saying it. There was a long pause on the line, and then, quietly, she asked me if I trusted her enough to disappear for a few days, somewhere far away from Manhattan, somewhere no one would think to look for either of us. I said yes before she'd even finished the question. I had no idea yet where she was thinking of taking me, only that for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wanted to follow someone somewhere without asking a single question about what came after. I fell asleep that night with the phone still warm against my cheek, her voice the last thing I heard before drifting off, completely unaware that within days, I'd be standing in the middle of a snow-covered mountain town, finally free enough to love her without an audience watching our every move. Evelyn wouldn't tell me where we were going, only that I should pack warm clothes and clear my calendar for 4 days. I remember standing in my closet the next morning, choosing sweaters instead of gowns for the first time in longer than I could remember, feeling a strange, giddy nervousness that had nothing to do with cameras or seating charts. She picked me up herself, No driver, no assistant trailing behind with a schedule. Just the two of us in a car she'd rented under a name that wasn't hers. We landed in Aspen a few hours later, and I understood immediately why she'd chosen it. Nobody in our world would ever picture Evelyn Hartwell curled up somewhere so quiet, so far from a camera. The mountains rose up around the small town in sharp, snow-covered peaks, and the air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in years, cold enough to sting my lungs in a way that somehow felt like relief rather than discomfort. The cabin she'd found sat alone at the end of a narrow, snow-packed road, wood-paneled and warm, with a stone fireplace already crackling by the time we walked through the door. No neighbors close enough to see us, no staff moving quietly through the halls, pretending not to notice things they weren't supposed to see. Just the two of us, finally, completely alone, without a single mask either of us needed to wear. That first night, we sat together on the rug in front of the fire, wrapped in blankets, saying almost nothing at all. It was strange how comfortable the silence felt, after months of careful words chosen to protect us from being overheard. Evelyn rested her head against my shoulder at some point, and I felt her exhale slowly, like she was releasing a breath she'd been holding for years without realizing it. "I keep waiting for someone to knock on that door," she admitted quietly, staring into the flames. "For my phone to ring with some crisis only I can fix." I reached for her hand under the blanket, lacing our fingers together. "Nobody's coming," I told her. "Not for 4 days." She turned to look at me then, and something in her expression had softened completely, all the careful control gone, replaced by something rawer and far more honest. "I don't know how to just be still," she whispered. "I've never let myself." I brought her hand up to my lips, pressing a slow kiss against her knuckles, feeling her breath catch at the gesture. "Then let me help you learn," I said softly. She leaned in first this time. No hesitation, no fear of cameras or boardrooms, or anyone watching from across a crowded room. Her lips found mine slowly, unhurried, carrying none of the desperate urgency of that first kiss in the rain, replaced instead by something steadier, something that felt like coming home, rather than escaping somewhere forbidden. Her hands framed my face gently as we kissed, and I felt every wall she'd spent a lifetime building simply dissolve beneath my fingertips. When we finally pulled back, foreheads resting together, both of us breathing unevenly in the firelight, she let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "I forgot what this felt like," she said, "being wanted without conditions attached to it." I pressed one more soft kiss to the corner of her mouth, unable to help myself. "Get used to it," I whispered. "I'm not attaching any." We woke the next morning tangled together under a mountain of blankets, snow falling steadily outside the frosted window, the whole world outside reduced to soft white silence. For 4 days, neither of us checked a single headline. We cooked clumsy meals together in the small kitchen, took long walks through snow that came up past our ankles, and talked about everything we'd never had the safety to say out loud before. I watched Evelyn laugh freely for the first time since I'd known her. A real laugh, unguarded, and a little too loud. And I fell in love with her all over again in that sound alone. On our last night in that cabin, sitting together on the porch wrapped in every blanket we could find, watching our breath fog in the freezing mountain air, I finally let myself think about what came next. Manhattan was still out there, waiting, with all its cameras and boardrooms and a family who hadn't yet forgiven me for breaking off my engagement. Evelyn must have felt the shift in my mood, because she squeezed my hand gently, her eyes finding mine in the porch light. "Whatever happens when we go back," she said quietly, "I need you to know that this wasn't a mistake I'm running from. This was the first true thing I've chosen for myself in years." I believed her completely. I had no idea yet just how hard the world outside that snow-covered cabin was about to test exactly how much that truth could withstand. The flight back to Manhattan felt shorter than it should have, the mountains disappearing behind us far too quickly for my liking. I remember watching the city skyline emerge through the clouds, all glass and steel and 1,000 watching eyes, and feeling my stomach tighten with a dread that had nothing to do with turbulence. Evelyn reached over and took my hand without a word, and I understood she felt exactly the same thing settling over both of us. My mother was waiting when I finally walked back into my apartment, her face a mixture of fury and barely concealed panic. She'd already heard, of course. News like ours traveled faster than any plane could carry us home. She spent nearly an hour listing everything I stood to lose: the business partnerships, the family reputation, the life she'd spent decades building for me whether I'd asked her to or not. I let her finish every word before I answered. "I know exactly what I'm risking," I told her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I've spent my whole life being careful with everything except my own happiness. I'm done doing that." She didn't respond right away. For the first time in my entire life, I watched something shift behind my mother's eyes. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the smallest beginning of it. She left without another word, though she didn't slam the door on her way out, and somehow that quiet felt like more progress than any argument could have. Evelyn faced her own version of that reckoning. Board members who still weren't fully convinced, industry whispers that hadn't entirely faded, a handful of old friends who quietly distanced themselves once our story became public. She handled it all with a steadiness I hadn't seen in her before that trip to the mountains, like the woman who'd finally learned to breathe in that cabin had brought that same steady breath home with her. We didn't get some perfect cinematic ending where the whole world suddenly embraced us. Some doors stayed closed. A few friendships quietly ended. My mother still calls sometimes, her voice careful and unsure, feeling out the edges of a relationship we're both still learning how to rebuild. Evelyn's company lost a few nervous investors, though far fewer than the board had originally feared, and life, mostly, simply went on around us, indifferent to how much courage it had taken to get here. What I do have, though, is her. Late nights that no longer feel lonely. A quiet apartment that finally feels like a home instead of a stage. The way she still reaches for my hand under restaurant tables. Less out of habit now. More because she genuinely wants to. I think about that broken bouquet sometimes, the one I still keep pressed and dried in an old book on my shelf. And I wonder if some small, foolish part of me knew, even then, exactly what those flowers were trying to tell me. There are still hard days. There's still a world outside our door that doesn't always make room for a love like ours, that still whispers and photographs and questions things it has no business questioning. But I've learned that safety was never really what I was looking for in the first place. I spent 28 years being safe, being managed, being someone else's careful decision. What I have now isn't safe. It's real. And somehow, that's turned out to be worth every single risk we took to get here. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you, genuinely, for sitting with me through every quiet ache and every small, stolen moment of joy. If you want the uncensored version of everything that happened in that cabin, and a few other details we couldn't quite share here, you can find that over on our Patreon, linked below. And if this story meant something to you, do me one last favor. Hit that like button, and leave a comment with your name so we can give you a personal shout-out in our next video. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope, wherever you are, you find the courage to choose your own happiness too, even when it isn't the safe choice at all.